Welcome back to The Shadows. Before we uncover tonight's archived file, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never get lost in the dark. David Vance woke up at precisely 3:14 a.m. to the sound of absolute silence. His skin coated in a slick, freezing sheen of sweat. The master bedroom of his two-story farmhouse in Oak Haven, Oregon, was plunged into pitch darkness, save for the pale, unnatural moonlight filtering through the lace curtains. Standing at the foot of his bed, perfectly upright and completely motionless in the shadows, was his wife, Clara. She wore the dark blue silk nightgown she had been buried in 8 days prior, her long arms resting naturally at her sides. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, fixed directly upon his pale face in the damp gloom. When David scrambled backward against the wooden headboard, his breath hitching violently in his chest as he demanded to know what she was doing, Clara merely offered a soft, tranquil smile. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was smooth, warm, and utterly natural, completely devoid of any raspy decay or medical exhaustion. She gently told him that he was simply having a bad dream, advising him to close his eyes and rest because his mind was tired and confused. But David knew he was awake, and he knew with sickening, absolute certainty that the woman standing at the edge of his mattress had been lowered 6 feet into the damp soil of Cedar Crest Cemetery just 1 week ago. Before her sudden passing, Clara had been the living, vibrant core of David's world. They had been married for less than 6 months when the aggressive glioblastoma was diagnosed, reducing a vibrant, athletic 28-year-old woman to a bedridden shadow in a matter of weeks. When her heart finally stopped in the intensive care unit, the entire foundation of David's life shattered completely. A former collegiate runner who had once prided himself on physical conditioning and strict discipline, David surrendered entirely to grief and heavy alcohol consumption. Within days of her funeral, his living room was littered with empty bourbon bottles, the heavy curtains pulled shut against the daylight, his existence blurring into a continuous, drunken stupor as he wept alone on the cold floorboards. It was on the 6th night following the burial that his longtime childhood friend, Marcus, arrived at the farmhouse. Disgusted by David's physical collapse, Marcus dragged him out of the house and forced him into the passenger seat of his truck. They drove 20 miles deep into the unmapped timberlands of Blackwood Ridge, stopping at a dense clearing where the ruins of a 19th century pioneer homestead lay buried beneath wild ivy. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient circular stone well, its masonry choked with dark moss, the water far below completely invisible in the night. Marcus, holding a dim flashlight, turned to David with a strangely solemn expression, instructing him to step up to the stone lip, drop a coin into the black void, and recite a specific phrase. "I stand before you pleading." Marcus insisted the well was a forgotten site of spiritual exchange, an ancient threshold where desperate men could bargain for what had been taken by the grave. Drunk, bitter, and consumed by grief, David had treated the entire ritual as a cruel, absurd joke. He pulled a rusted quarter from his pocket, flipped it into the black abyss, and mockingly shouted the words into the damp mountain air. "I stand before you, pleading," he had yelled, laughing sarcastically as the coin vanished without making a sound. In his drunken arrogance, he added his own defiant caveat to the wish. He told whatever resided in the well that he did not just want Clara returned. He wanted her brought back stronger, made so durable and resilient that no disease, no decay, and no physical force could ever destroy her again. Marcus had stared at him in quiet horror, but David merely stumbled back to the truck, convinced he had indulged a foolish local legend. 36 hours later, at 2:15 a.m. on a rain-drenched Tuesday morning, the heavy oak front door of the farmhouse vibrated with 3 deliberate, rhythmic knocks. David, sitting on the couch with a half-empty glass in his hand, had crept to the hallway, pulling the door open expecting to see a sheriff's deputy or a lost driver. Instead, Standing under the amber glow of the porch light, soaked in cold rain, was Clara. She looked radiant, her skin smooth, her cheeks flushed with life, completely free of the hollow exhaustion that had defined her final weeks in the hospital. She had stepped across the threshold, brushing the wet hair from her face, speaking casually about how cold the walk from the road had been, asking David why he was staring at her as though he had seen a phantom. In the days immediately following Clara's impossible return, David lived in a state of suspended reality, his mind fractured between relief and an escalating, icy dread. During the daytime hours, Clara performed the routines of a devoted wife with flawless, fluid precision. She moved through the kitchen with grace, preparing hot breakfasts, washing dishes, and vacuuming the rugs while humming soft melodies she had loved before her illness. Her conversation was articulate, warm, and entirely coherent. She recalled intimate memories from their wedding, asked about his job at the regional timber yard, and expressed gentle concern over his disheveled appearance and the lingering smell of alcohol in the hallways. When David, trembling with anxiety, attempted to ask her how she was standing in their kitchen, where she had been for the past week, or how she had escaped the locked casket beneath Cedar Crest, Clara would pause, smile with serene affection, and brush his cheek with her fingers, telling him that he was overthinking things, that his grief had made him confused, and that all that mattered was that they were together again. However, as the initial shock wore off, subtle, terrifying anomalies began to surface within the domestic routine of the farmhouse. David stopped drinking entirely, desperate to preserve the absolute clarity of his senses. And in his sobriety, the unnatural details became impossible to ignore. The most immediate anomaly was her relationship with food and sustenance. Clara spent hours in the kitchen preparing elaborate, aromatic meals for David, plating them meticulously on their finest china. Yet her own plate remained completely untouched. Whenever David sat across from her at the dining table, watching her intently, Clara would engage in animated conversation, lifting a fork to her lips only to set it down again without taking a single bite. When he directly pressed her to eat, she would laugh softly, claiming she had snacked while cooking or that her stomach felt entirely satisfied, deflecting his inquiries with effortless charm that left no room for argument. By the fourth night, David realized that Clara did not sleep. Each evening, she would change into her nightgown, lie beside him under the heavy blankets, and close her eyes until he drifted off. But whenever David awoke in the middle of the night, whether at 1 a.m., 3 a.m., or 4 a.m., the space beside him was empty and cold. He would creep down the dark hallway to find her sitting perfectly upright in an unlit armchair in the corner of the parlor, her eyes wide open, staring unblinkingly at the shadowed wallboards. On other occasions, he found her standing motionless by the living room window, gazing out into the pitch-black tree-line of the surrounding forest for hours without shifting her weight or making a sound. If he confronted her in those dark hours, she would turn her head with a smooth, deliberate movement, her expression unbothered, repeating the same soothing phrase, "You are just confused, David. Go back to bed." The psychological strain reached a terrifying threshold on Friday afternoon, when David witnessed the physical manifestation of his drunken wish. While clearing the lunch table, Clara accidentally bumped a heavy porcelain serving platter off the edge of the counter. Instinctively, she reached out and caught the falling dish against the oak cabinet. The force of her grip was so immense that the thick porcelain shattered violently into fine powder and jagged shards within her palm. David gasped, rushing forward with a towel, expecting to see her palm torn open and bleeding profusely. But when Clara opened her fingers and let the crushed porcelain dust rain down onto the floorboards, her palm was entirely unblemished. Her skin showed no cuts, no bruising, and no indentation whatsoever. It possessed an unnatural, dense firmness that resembled polished marble rather than human tissue. She looked at her uninjured hand with mild curiosity, offered a faint, chilling smile, and remarked that she supposed she didn't know her own strength anymore. That night, unable to shake the image of the crushed porcelain, David feigned sleep, keeping his eyes slitted in the darkness. At 2:45 a.m., he felt the mattress shift as Clara silently rose from the bed. Instead of remaining in the house, she glided down the staircase, unlatched the back door, and stepped out into the freezing midnight air. David threw on his coat, unholstered his hunting flashlight, and followed her into the dark backyard. He tracked her silhouette across the wet grass toward the edge of the woods, staying 50 yards behind. As she reached the dense treeline, Clara did not walk. She accelerated with terrifying, unnatural speed, moving between the towering pines in absolute silence. When David reached the spot where she had entered the forest, he shined his light down at the damp earth. Imprinted in the deep mud were her footprints, but they were not the shallow tracks of a 120-pound woman. The depressions were sunken 4 inches deep into the packed clay, as though the creature wearing Clara's face weighed well over 1,000 pounds. The rain was falling in relentless, icy sheets when David arrived at Marcus's rustic timber cabin on the western edge of Blackwood Ridge. David didn't bother knocking on the worn frame. He kicked the heavy wooden front door wide open and stepped into the dim, wood stove-heated living room. Marcus was sitting alone at his workbench, carefully cleaning a hunting rifle, but he froze in place when he saw the hollow, frantic look in David's eyes. David slammed the door behind him, locking the heavy deadbolt, his breathing coming in ragged, white plumes in the drafty, shadow-filled room. He didn't waste precious time with polite greetings or rational explanations. He marched across the room, grabbed Marcus by the worn collar of his flannel shirt, hauling him violently out of his chair, and demanded to know what kind of ancient, unnatural curse was dwelling in the stone well deep in the woods. When David recounted the terrifying events of the past week, Clara's miraculous appearance on his porch, her complete refusal to consume food or water, her sleepless nocturnal trances, her terrifying marble-like physical durability, and the 4-inch deep footprints left in the wet forest clay, the remaining color drained completely from Marcus's face. The hunting rifle slid from his trembling lap, clattering loudly against the braided floor rug. Marcus didn't try to defend himself, nor did he accuse David of being drunk or delusional. Instead, his hands began to shake violently as he sank back into his wooden chair, staring at the floorboards in absolute, speech-deprived horror. In a low, shaken whisper that was barely audible over the roaring wind and rain outside, Marcus confessed the true, dark history behind the Pioneer Well on Blackwood Ridge. It was not a wishing well, and it had never belonged to ordinary Oregon homesteaders. In the late 19th century, a secretive sect of outcast miners known as the Stone Anchor Fellowship had constructed the well over a deep, unnatural fissure in the ancient mountain bedrock. The miners believed that the subterranean strata of the earth possessed an ancient, conscious weight, an immortal, non-human presence that despised the fragile, decaying nature of organic life. They referred to this hidden presence as the Iron Foundation. The well was built as a physical conduit for a dark, irreversible exchange. If a grieving person approached the stone rim, offered a token, and spoke the invocation of surrender, the entity sleeping in the depths would answer the call. "It doesn't bring back human souls, David," Marcus stammered, his voice choked with pure panic as he wiped cold sweat from his pale forehead. "It doesn't care about human love, grief, or second chances. It merely mimics life by drawing upon the memories and emotional impressions left behind in the minds of the living. But when it crafts a body, it constructs the vessel out of dense subterranean earth, compacted mineral silt, and living stone." Marcus paused, clutching his knees in fear. "You asked for her to be brought back stronger, didn't you? You stood over that well and told it you wanted her so durable that no disease or physical force could ever break her again." Marcus looked up, his eyes wide with absolute dread. "You gave the entity a blueprint. It didn't resurrect Clara's soul. It forged a heavy, indestructible mimic using her shape, her voice, and her memories. And the longer it remains in your house, the heavier it will become as it anchors itself permanently to our world. Marcus warned David that the creature would continue to play the role of the devoted, loving wife as long as David accepted the illusion without any resistance. But he warned that the moment the mimic realized its false nature had been fully recognized, its behavior would shift from gentle mimicry to absolute containment. It would never allow David to leave the farmhouse, because he was the physical anchor holding it to the surface world. Shaken to his absolute core by Marcus's disturbing revelation, David drove away from the rustic cabin into the blinding midnight downpour, his trembling hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He knew with terrifying clarity that he could not simply return to the warmth of the farmhouse and pretend everything was normal. He needed absolute, irrefutable physical proof before he confronted the indestructible thing currently occupying his home. Driving through the pitch-black backroads of Oakhaven, he pulled his heavy truck into the narrow, flooded gravel lane of Cedar Crest Cemetery. The towering iron gates were unlocked, swaying gently in the gale-force wind as the tall pine trees cast long, writhing shadows across the wet headstones. David parked his truck behind the maintenance shed, turned off the headlights, and grabbed a heavy steel shovel and a solid iron crowbar from the truck bed. Navigating by the narrow beam of his tactical flashlight, he trekked through the thick mud to the far eastern corner of the grounds, where the fresh graves were located. He stopped directly at the foot of a polished granite headstone bearing his late wife's name, Clara Vance, beloved wife. The earth above her plot was still dark, loose, and soft, the freshly laid grass turf not yet rooted into the wet mud. With a desperate, feverish energy, David drove the sharp blade of the shovel into the soaked earth. Icy rain washed down his face and neck, mixing with his heavy sweat as he dug relentlessly into the dark soil. The physical work was grueling, the wet clay clinging stubbornly to the steel blade, but his escalating terror fueled his exhausted muscles. For nearly 2 hours, the only sounds echoing in the silent cemetery were the heavy thud of the shovel, the howling wind, and David's ragged breathing. 4 feet down, 5 feet down, finally 6 feet below the muddy surface, the tip of his steel shovel struck a hard, hollow wood surface with a dull metallic thud that echoed in the pit. David cleared the remaining thick mud from the lid of the dark mahogany casket he had purchased just 10 days ago. His heart hammered violently against his ribs as he stepped onto the wooden box, jamming the flat edge of his crowbar beneath the brass locking latches. He put his entire body weight into the iron lever. The rusted brass screws sheared off with a sharp, echoing snap, and the heavy mahogany lid creaked open, releasing a faint smell of damp earth and chemical formaldehyde into the freezing night air. David raised his flashlight, shining the bright beam directly into the open coffin. A cold, suffocating wave of pure horror washed over him, causing him to drop the crowbar into the mud below. Resting quietly inside the soaked white satin lining was Clara's actual physical body. She was still wearing the dark blue silk nightgown, her skin pale, gray, and sunken, showing the clear, irreversible signs of natural decomposition and medical wasting. Her glioblastoma-riddled body had never left the ground. She was dead, cold, and entirely motionless beneath 6 feet of Oregon soil. The realization hit David with the weight of a falling mountain. The radiant, indestructible woman currently sitting in his warm living room, cooking his meals, and walking through his quiet hallways was not his wife. It was a massive, monstrous mimic crafted from the dark mineral depths of the ancient well, an immortal imposter carrying Clara's stolen memories like a mask. As David stood frozen in the muddy pit, staring down at his wife's actual corpse, the cell phone in his coat pocket suddenly vibrated against his chest. Trembling violently, he pulled the device out and looked at the illuminated screen. It was a text message sent directly from Clara's phone number. David opened the message, his blood running completely cold as he read the words displayed on the screen. "Why are you digging in the mud, David? I am already home waiting for you. Please come back to bed." David stood in the muddy grave, the cold rain soaking through his coat as he stared at his phone screen. The text from Clara's number burned into his vision. The air in the cemetery felt suffocatingly thick, as though the night had turned to liquid lead. Panic, raw and primal, kicked his heart into overdrive. He scrambled out of the 6-foot pit, abandoning his shovel and crowbar in the mud, and sprinted to his truck. He threw himself into the cab, locked the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned the key, the engine roaring to life, and slammed his foot on the accelerator, spraying gravel as he tore out of Cedar Crest Cemetery. The drive back to the farmhouse was a blur of blinding rain and frantic calculations. Marcus's warning echoed in his mind. The moment the mimic realizes its false nature has been recognized, its behavior will shift from gentle mimicry to absolute containment. David knew he couldn't simply flee the state. The creature was anchored to his mind, to his memories, and to the foolish vow he had uttered over the dark waters of the Pioneer Well. He needed to return to the house, collect his essential documents, cash, and his late father's heavy rifle, and figure out how to sever the connection before the entity permanently entombed him within his home. When David pulled his truck into the gravel driveway at 4:10 a.m., every window in the 2-story building was dark, save for the single amber lamp burning in the parlor. His hand trembled violently as he turned off the ignition and stepped out into the freezing downpour. He approached the front porch with agonizing slowness, his boots crunching on wet gravel. He reached for the brass doorknob, taking a deep breath to compose his face, praying he could conceal the terror gnawing at his gut. He turned the knob and pushed the heavy oak door open. Standing directly on the other side, less than 3 inches from the threshold, was Clara. She was wearing the same dark blue silk nightgown, her long dark hair falling over her shoulders. Her face was serene, perfectly unblemished, but her dark eyes were completely fixed upon his. The air inside the hallway smelled of deep, stagnant cavern air, wet clay, and crushed granite. "You've been out in the rain for a very long time, David," Clara said softly, her voice smooth and measured, devoid of any shivering or fatigue. She reached out, her cool, firm fingers wrapping around his wrist. Her grip was gentle, yet it carried an immovable density that made it impossible for him to pull away without snapping his bone. "Your coat is soaked. Your hands are covered in dirt. Why were you at the cemetery?" David's stomach plummeted into a cold abyss. He forced his mouth to form a weak smile, trying desperately to keep his voice steady. He lied, claiming he had gone out for a drive to clear his head, that he had stopped by the old timber yard to check on equipment. But as he spoke, Clara didn't blink. She simply stared into his eyes, her gaze searching the depths of his mind like a hand reaching into dark water. "Lying makes you sound tired, David," she whispered, stepping backward into the hallway and pulling him gently across the threshold. As her feet moved across the hardwood floor, a low, ominous groan resonated from beneath the rug. The heavy oak floorboards bent noticeably beneath her weight, hairline fractures spreading through the finish around her feet. She was no longer bothering to fully suppress her immense physical mass. She turned around, walking toward the kitchen, leaving David standing in the foyer. Behind his back, the heavy front door swung shut on its own with a loud thud. The brass deadbolt slid into place with a heavy click, and when David reached behind him to turn the latch, the iron mechanism refused to budge, frozen solid as if fused directly into the doorframe. David stared at the fused lock, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked down at the threshold where Clara had been standing. Deep, spiderweb cracks had radiated out from the doorframe across the plaster walls, as if the entire entrance was buckling under immense downward pressure. From the kitchen, the clatter of silver utensils against porcelain echoed down the corridor, orderly and mundane, completely juxtaposed against the horror filling the air. "I made hot tea, David," Clara called out from the kitchen, her voice ringing clear and sweet. "Come sit down. We need to talk about our future." David moved toward the parlor instead, keeping his footsteps silent. He slipped into the darkened parlor, stepping around the old leather armchair. He reached into his pocket for his keys, intending to open his father's locked glass gun cabinet in the corner of the room. But when he reached the wooden cabinet, his jaw dropped in silent horror. The heavy glass display cabinet had been utterly crushed. The thick oak frame was splintered, the glass reduced to fine sand, and his father's heavy Winchester rifle was bent completely in half, the steel barrel folded over like a piece of soft wire. Sitting on the small side table beside the ruined cabinet was a single, smooth piece of dark river stone. David backed away, his throat dry, his mind racing. He realized with chilling clarity that the mimic was systematically stripping away any illusion of human frailty. It was setting the stage for total containment. "You shouldn't have looked in the cabinet, David." Clara's voice came from the darkened doorway behind him. He spun around. She was standing in the parlor entrance, framing the doorway. The amber light from the hallway illuminated her silhouette, but her shadow on the wall behind her was vast, misshapen, and dense. Not the outline of a slender woman, but a massive, jagged pillar of rock extending all the way to the ceiling joists. "I gave you time to adjust," Clara said, taking a slow step forward. The floorboards under her feet shrieked in protest, the plaster on the ceiling above her beginning to flake and rain down in white dust. "I acted out the memories you cherished. I wore the clothes you remembered. But you went to the well with Marcus, and then you went to the grave. You broke the rules of the bargain, David." "You're not Clara," David choked out, backing up until his spine hit the cold glass of the window pane behind him. "Clara is dead. She's buried in the ground." Clara paused, her head tilting slightly to the left with an unnatural motion. Her expression remained gentle, but her dark eyes seemed to lose all reflection, turning into hollow voids. "Clara was weak," she replied softly. "Her body was fragile. It decayed. It bled. Failed you. I am what you truly asked for, David. I am the permanent anchor, and now you belong to the foundation." As Clara finished speaking, the floor beneath her feet buckled further, a deep crack tearing through the parlor floorboards. Realizing he had seconds before the creature seized him, David grabbed a heavy bronze floor lamp from beside the window and hurled it with all his strength at her face. The heavy bronze base struck Clara square in the forehead with a sickening metallic thud. The blow didn't knock her back, nor did it break her skin. Instead, the bronze lamp crumpled like aluminum foil against her forehead, leaving a faint gray scuff mark that instantly smoothed out like wet clay. The distraction gave David the briefest window of opportunity. Without turning around, he threw his weight backward into the double-paned window. The glass shattered violently, sending sharp shards tearing through his coat and slicing into his arms as he tumbled outward into the dark night. He landed hard on the wet gravel flower bed below, rolling twice before scrambling frantically to his feet. Behind him, the entire side of the farmhouse groaned under an unnatural weight. David looked up to see Clara stepping directly through the parlor wall. She did not open the window or break the frame. Her massive, mineral-dense physical presence simply crushed through the cedar siding and plaster, collapsing the wall studs like matchsticks as she stepped out into the rain. Plaster dust and shattered would rain down around her as she stood on the gravel, her dark blue nightgown unsoiled, her gaze remaining fixated on him. "Running only tires your heart, David," she called out, her voice easily cutting through the roar of the wind. "There is nowhere outside the foundation." David didn't wait to hear another word. He sprinted around the corner of the house toward his truck, his boots skidding in the mud. He reached the driver's side door, yanked it open, and threw himself inside, slamming his hand down on the power lock button. He jammed the key into the ignition, cranking the engine. The starter whined twice before the engine caught, roaring to life. David shoved the transmission into reverse, slamming his foot on the gas pedal. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he saw Clara pursuing him. She was not running in a human cadence. She moved with unnatural momentum, taking heavy strides that left deep craters in the driveway gravel. The ground shook beneath the truck with every step she took, the vibrations rattling the dashboard instruments. David spun the steering wheel, whipping the truck around, and slammed the accelerator forward, tearing out onto the dark country road. Through his rearview mirror, he watched her silhouette standing beneath the amber driveway light. She did not chase the vehicle onto the main road. She simply stood motionless in the rain, watching his taillights fade, her arm raised in a slow wave of farewell. Driven by panic, David raced down the back roads toward Marcus's cabin on Blackwood Ridge. Marcus was the only person who understood the true nature of the Pioneer well, the only one who might know if the anchor could be severed. The storm raged with unbridled fury, lightning illuminating the towering pines that arched over the narrow road like skeletal fingers. 20 minutes later, David slammed his brakes, his truck skidding to a halt in the muddy clearing outside Marcus's cabin. The property was plunged into absolute darkness, the wood stove chimney cold and lifeless. David scrambled out of his truck, his heart hammering in his throat, and ran up the wooden porch steps. "Marcus!" David shouted, pounding his fists against the door. "Marcus, open the door. It's David." There was no answer from inside. David reached for the doorknob, but his hand froze. The door was already unlatched, swinging open on its hinges with a low creak. David pulled his tactical flashlight from his pocket, clicking the beam on as he stepped cautiously across the threshold into the cabin. The interior was in total ruin. The heavy oak workbench had been snapped in half. The hunting rifle Marcus had been cleaning shattered into twisted metal scrap. The floorboards in the center of the living room were completely pulverized, caved inward into a jagged pit that plunged deep into the earth beneath the foundation. David approached the edge of the pit, his trembling flashlight beam shining down into the abyss. At the bottom of the 5-foot hole, embedded deeply within the wet clay and crushed bedrock, was Marcus's leather belt and torn flannel shirt. But there was no sign of Marcus's body. The clay inside the pit was compressed so tightly it resembled solid granite, stamped with the distinct impression of a heavy weight that had dragged him downward into the earth. As David backed away from the pit, his breath hitching in his throat, a sudden metallic scraping sound echoed from the dark corner of the cabin. The beam of his flashlight swept across the room, locking onto the small wooden table beside the ruined workbench. Sitting on the center of the table was Marcus's handheld two-way radio, its red power light blinking steadily in the dark. The speaker crackled with heavy static, and then, clear and terrifying, Clara's smooth voice echoed through the small cabin speaker. Marcus understood the weight of the well. "David, now he is part of the foundation. I am waiting for you at the rim. Come complete the vow." David dropped the crackling handheld radio onto the splintered wood of the table, his fingers numb with terror. The voice of the thing wearing his wife's face still echoed in his ears, carrying a dreadful weight that pressed physical air from his lungs. He backed out of Marcus's destroyed cabin, stepping over the threshold and plunging back into the torrential downpour. The storm on Blackwood Ridge had reached a fever pitch, gale-force winds whipping the tall firs back and forth like skeletal arms. But David barely felt the icy rain stinging his face. His mind was consumed by a single realization. He could not run from the entity, nor could he hide in the valley below. The bargain he had struck in a drunken fit of grief was an active spiritual anchor, drawing the crushing, mineral-dense presence into the world, and the only place to confront it was the source itself. He climbed into his truck, gripped the wheel with bloodless knuckles, and drove further up the narrow trail leading toward the abandoned pioneer clearing. The road grew increasingly treacherous, the heavy mud turning to thick sludge that sucked at his tires. 2 miles from the clearing, a massive fallen hemlock tree blocked the path, its thick trunk shattered across the gravel. David didn't hesitate. He grabbed his tactical flashlight from the dashboard and a heavy iron crowbar from the floorboards, shoved the door open, and continued on foot into the dark forest. The wilderness surrounding the trail felt terrifyingly wrong. The deep woods were usually alive with the rustle of rain on foliage, the sway of branches, and the movement of wildlife. But as David pressed deeper into the timberlands of Blackwood Ridge, an unnatural quiet settled over the trees. The wind still howled through the upper canopy, yet the ground beneath his boots felt strangely rigid, the wet mud solidifying into a dense surface that resembled wet slate rather than soft earth. The roots of the pine trees protruding from the soil did not look like living wood. They were blackened and coated in a crystalline crust of dark mineral silt that reflected his flashlight beam like polished iron. Following his memory through the brush, David located the hidden stone markers left behind by the 19th century stone anchor fellowship. Etched into the bark of ancient hemlocks were geometric symbols, concentric circles intersecting with a heavy vertical line, the sign of the iron foundation. The air grew colder, carrying a sharp, metallic odor that smelled of ozone, stagnant cavern water, and crushed granite. His breathing produced thick, white plumes in the gloom, the temperature dropping far below freezing despite the autumn rain. At 5:20 a.m., David broke through the final thicket of brambles and stepped into the clearing of the pioneer homestead. In the center of the muddy expanse sat the ancient circular stone well. The clearing was illuminated by an unnatural luminescence radiating from the mouth of the well, a faint amber glow that cast distorted shadows across the overgrown weeds. Surrounding the well were three low, dry stone structures, the collapsed ruins of the fellowship's meeting house. David approached the stone walls of the ruined shelter, shining his light across the interior masonry. Carved deep into the flat granite lintel above the doorway was a series of archaic inscriptions written by the original miners. Using the sleeve of his coat, he wiped away decades of wet moss, revealing the carved text. The passage was brief, a chilling record left by the last surviving elder of the order before the site was abandoned. The foundation does not grant life, for life is fragile and fleeting. It grants permanence. What enters the pit as flesh returns as unyielding stone, bound to the soul that summoned it. The anchor cannot be severed by iron, fire, or distance. It can only be broken if the summoner willingly offers their own weight to the abyss, or if the mimic consumes the anchor entirely. David's blood turned to ice as he absorbed the words. The entity had not merely mimicked Clara to deceive him. It was systematically isolating him, stripping away his home, his friends, and his sanity until he had no choice but to return to the rim. He was the anchor. As long as he lived and carried the memory of her loss, the creature would continue to draw mass from the subterranean depths, becoming heavier and denser until it crushed everything in its path. A sudden thud resonated through the bedrock beneath his boots, shaking the stone ruins and sending dust raining from the lintel. David spun around, raising his flashlight toward the center of the clearing. Rising slowly from the dark mouth of the well was a thick column of mineral mist, swirling in the freezing rain. Standing at the edge of the stone rim, framed by the pale amber glow of the pit, was Clara. The figure standing at the mouth of the well did not move with the shivering hesitation of a human exposed to the freezing mountain gale. Clara stood perfectly rigid, her dark blue silk nightgown fluttering in the wind, but her body remained utterly still, as unyielding as an iron monument set into the earth. The pale amber light emanating from the well illuminated her face, casting stark shadows across her features. Up close, David could see that her skin had lost all resemblance to organic flesh. It possessed a smooth, marble-like sheen, subtle veins of dark mineral silt visible beneath the surface like fine fractures in polished granite. Her dark eyes were fixed upon him, devoid of white or pupils, reflecting the dim beam of his flashlight like two spheres of polished obsidian. "You came back, David," she said, her voice no longer resembling the gentle cadence of his deceased wife. It was a multi-layered, resonant phenomenon, echoing as though spoken through miles of subterranean stone corridors. The sound vibrated through the mud, rattling the bones in David's feet before reaching his ears. You tried to run, but the anchor always draws the chain back to the winch. David raised his heavy iron crowbar, his hands trembling violently as he maintained his grip on the cold metal. He took a cautious step forward, keeping 10 feet of distance between them. "I know what you are," David shouted above the roar of the wind, his breath ragged and white in the freezing air. "You're not Clara. You never were. You're a monster forged out of rock and mud." Using her memory like a mask, Clara tilted her head with that same slow motion, her obsidian eyes unblinking. "I am what your heart demanded," she replied, her voice calm and devoid of anger. "You sat in your dark house, drowning in liquor, screaming at the heavens that love was useless because flesh is weak. You begged for her to be made durable. You asked for a wife that could never bleed, never rot, and never be taken by disease." She took a single step toward him. The ground beneath her foot groaned under immense weight, a deep crack tearing through the frozen mud and radiating outward across the clearing. "The bargain is simple and absolute," she continued, extending her pale, marble-like hand toward him. "An organic soul cannot command the weight of the iron foundation from the surface. To sustain this form, the anchor must be balanced. You must complete the surrender you spoke at the rim." "And if I refuse?" David choked out, backing away toward the ruined stone walls. "If I walk away and never speak her name again?" Clara's expression did not alter, but the pale amber light inside the well flared with sudden intensity. A low vibration erupted from deep within the earth, shaking the mountain ridge. "You cannot walk away, David," Clara whispered, her voice echoing from the earth beneath his feet. "The anchor has already taken root. If you refuse to balance the weight, the foundation will expand. It will draw your house, your town, and every living thing in this valley down into the dark stone until the entire region becomes solid rock. Look beneath your feet." David looked down, shining his flashlight beam at the ground. The wet mud of the clearing was rapidly crystallizing, turning into rigid, black shale before his eyes. The grass and brambles were turning to solid stone, frozen in place like museum artifacts. The mineral infection was spreading outward from the well in an expanding circle, creeping toward the slopes leading to Oakhaven. Realizing the terrifying scale of the disaster he had unleashed, David raised the iron crowbar above his head, roaring in desperate defiance. He lunged forward, swinging the heavy steel bar with all his strength directly at Clara's neck, determined to shatter the vessel before him. Clara didn't dodge or raise her arms to defend herself. The heavy steel crowbar struck her neck with a deafening metallic screech that echoed across the ridge like a sledgehammer hitting an anvil. High-voltage sparks erupted from the point of contact, illuminating the dark clearing in brilliant white flashes. The heavy iron bar bent completely in half upon impact, crumpled like paper, while Clara's neck showed not even a faint scratch. Without breaking eye contact, Clara reached out and took the bent iron tool from his hands. Her fingers crushed the solid steel into a compact ball of metal, letting it drop into the mud with a dull thud. She stepped closer, her freezing hand resting gently against David's chest, directly over his hammering heart. The skin of her fingers felt like polished ice, sending a numbing shockwave through his ribs that paralyzed his muscles. Beneath David's feet, the frozen ground cracked open with a thunderous roar. A yawning fissure tore through the shale, exposing the black, bottomless abyss of the well shaft directly behind him. The edges of the fissure began to crumble, sending heavy chunks of stone falling into the dark void below, while Clara's grip on his chest tightened, slowly tilting his balance backward toward the edge of the pit. David felt the freezing numbness creeping from the entity's palm directly into his chest, spreading through his ribs like liquid nitrogen. The air in his lungs crystallized instantly, making every shallow breath feel like inhaling crushed glass. Held at the edge of the yawning black fissure, his feet suspended over the bottomless void of the well, he looked into the face of the creature wearing his wife's features. The skin on her cheeks was no longer smooth skin. It had turned into a polished, seamless expanse of dark granite, vein-like fractures radiating from her jawline down her neck. The entity did not speak with human breath, but the acoustic resonance vibrating from her chest filled the freezing night air, echoing across the desolate ridge with the crushing weight of a falling mountain. In that terrifying moment, suspended between life and the subterranean abyss, David realized the fatal error he had made. Violence, steel weapons, and physical resistance were completely meaningless against a force forged from the deep strata of the earth. The creature was indestructible because he had demanded it to be. He had stood over the pioneer well in a drunken rage, rejecting the fragile reality of mortality, asking for something that could never rot, never bleed, and never be broken. The entity was merely a physical reflection of his own refusal to accept Clara's death. His grief was the fuel, and his stolen memories were the blueprint holding the monster together. As the mimic pulled him an inch closer to the brink, the ground beneath them dropping away into the dark abyss, David stopped fighting the physical pressure. Instead, he forced his mind away from the terrifying creature before him and reached deep into the painful, buried reality of his past. He closed his eyes and summoned the precise memory he had spent months trying to drown in alcohol, the final agonizing hour in the intensive care unit. He remembered the faint, irregular beep of the heart monitor, the smell of antiseptic, the soft warmth of her frail, trembling hand, and the heartbreaking stillness that filled the room when her breathing finally ceased. He embraced the agonizing truth he had fled from. Clara was dead. Her physical body was cold, fragile, and sleeping 6 feet beneath the damp soil of Cedar Crest Cemetery. She was not an immortal pillar of stone. She was a delicate, beautiful human being who had lived, suffered, and passed away. The moment David fully surrendered to the reality of his grief, a sharp, violent tremor rippled through the entity's marble frame. The obsidian voids of her eyes flickered, the smooth surface of her cheek popping with a sound like a cracking whip. A deep, jagged fracture tore across her forehead, leaking a thick, dark slurry of wet clay and pulverized mineral silt onto her silk nightgown. The acoustic resonance radiating from her voice stuttered, shifting from a thunderous roar into a broken, distorted frequency that sounded like grinding stones. David! Her voice glitched, the warm, familiar tone of his wife briefly breaking through the subterranean drone before distorting back into a raspy screech. The anchor! You are dissolving the blueprint. The sudden destabilization of the mimic's physical mass caused her grip on his chest to loosen for a fraction of a second. Seizing the brief window of opportunity, David threw his weight sideways, twisting his body out of her grasp. He hit the frozen shale ledge at the edge of the pit, scrambling frantically on his hands and knees away from the yawning void. The edge of the fissure crumbled under the immense weight of the entity, heavy slabs of black shale cascading down into the darkness. Clara's mimic form stumbled backward, her heavy, mineral-dense boots crushing the crumbling lip of the well shaft. A massive subterranean roar erupted from the depths as the pit attempted to pull its unstable creation back into the earth. The pale amber light radiating from the well turned into a violent, pulsing crimson, throwing long, writhing shadows across the clearing as the ground around the homestead began to collapse inward toward the central shaft. David scrambled across the fracturing ground, his boots skidding over sheets of black shale as the clearing collapsed into the widening mouth of the pioneer well. The surrounding pine trees groaned as their roots were torn from the petrified soil, falling one by one into the roaring darkness below. Desperate to find shelter from the falling debris and the wave of mineral cold, David threw his body through the low stone archway of the ruined meeting house, collapsing onto the frozen dirt floor of the sanctuary. Inside the ancient stone structure, the air was suffocatingly thick, smelling of aged sulfur, wet limestone, and decay. The timber roof had long since rotted away, but the massive granite walls, for feet thick and reinforced with dark iron bands, remained standing against the storm. In the center of the inner chamber sat the original altar of the Stone Anchor Fellowship, a massive block of unpolished basalt, carved with geometric concentric circles. Embedded into the top of the basalt altar was a heavy iron capstone, sealed with lead rivets and stamped with the numerical sequence of the 19 miners. David pushed himself up from the cold floor, wiping blood and mineral dust from his eyes. He realized with clarity that the basalt altar was the physical keystone of the entire site, the original spiritual junction constructed to channel the subterranean frequency from the deep fissure up to the wellhead. If the iron capstone on the altar could be shattered, the connection between the subterranean entity and the surface world would sever, collapsing the mineral infection before it reached the valley below. He searched the dark floor of the sanctuary, his flashlight beam catching a heavy steel sledgehammer resting against the base of the altar, a tool left behind by the miners, its wood handle dark with age and oil. David grabbed the wooden handle, hauling the 30-pound steel hammer onto his shoulder, his muscles screaming with exhaustion. Before he could raise the hammer above the altar, a sound like grinding tectonic plates echoed from the doorway of the sanctuary. David spun around, shining his flashlight toward the entrance. Standing in the narrow stone archway was Clara, but her physical form was rapidly disintegrating into a nightmare of mineral decay. The smooth human facade had fractured completely. Deep, yawning cracks covered her face and torso, revealing a core of swirling black mud, molten copper, and dense mineral silt beneath the broken marble skin. Her dark blue nightgown was torn to shreds, encrusted with wet clay, and her left arm had broadened into a massive, misshapen club of jagged granite. Her voice no longer carried a single human tone. It spoke as a terrifying chorus, a dozen hollow voices speaking at once, blending the sound of the ancient miners, the cries of Marcus, and the distorted echo of Clara's final breaths. "You cannot break the capstone, David." The chorus resonated through the stone walls, shaking dust from the ceiling joists. "The anchor is not in the iron. The anchor is in your blood. If the capstone falls, the foundation will take you with it." The fractured mimic took a massive step into the chamber, her granite feet crushing the stone floorboards into fine powder. With every step she took, the 4-foot-thick walls of the meeting house groaned under severe structural tension, spiderweb cracks spreading across the granite blocks as the entity pulled the weight of the mountain down around them. David braced his feet on the trembling floor, lifting the heavy steel sledgehammer high above his head, pointing the iron head directly at the lead-sealed capstone on the altar. "Clara is already dead," David screamed into the terrifying chorus, his voice hoarse with rage and grief. "And I'm sending you back to the dark." Before the steel hammer could descend upon the altar, the massive granite lintel above the entrance collapsed with a deafening roar. Tons of stone and earth crashed downward into the sanctuary, sealing the doorway and plunging the inner chamber into total darkness, as the floor beneath David's feet buckled inward, dropping him and the crumbling monster toward the black abyss below. The fall through the collapsing floor was a brief, violent blur of rushing air and tumbling granite blocks. David Vance crashed hard onto a steep embankment of wet slate 30 feet beneath the surface of the ridge. The violent impact slammed the wind from his chest, sending his flashlight bouncing down into the darkness. He tumbled down the sharp incline, his limbs scraping against limestone edges, before coming to a halt against a basalt pillar. The subterranean chamber beneath the ruined meeting house was vast, hollow, and ice-cold. It was dominated by a colossal vertical monolith of volcanic bedrock that extended deep into the Earth's crust. The air inside the abyss was suffocatingly dense, thick with the sharp scent of burnt ozone and crushed granite. Veins of amber light pulsed erratically through the limestone walls, casting writhing shadows across the wreckage. A heavy impact echoed from the upper slope as the crumbling mimic of Clara landed on the slate embankment. Her vessel was almost completely destroyed. Half of her marble face had sloughed away from the impact. It exposed a churning interior of wet black clay, oxidized copper, and liquid iron beneath the surface. Yet, driven by the unyielding imperative, the entity dragged her misshapen body down the incline toward him. Her granite footfalls shattered the slate floorboards into fine powder as she advanced. David pushed himself up onto his knees, his vision swimming with dark spots as blood trickled down his forehead. 10 feet away, lying wedged beneath a fallen ceiling beam, was the heavy steel sledgehammer. Ignoring the searing pain in his dislocated shoulder, David dragged himself across the stone floor. His bloodied fingers wrapped tightly around the smooth wooden handle as he pulled it close. He hauled the heavy tool toward the base of the monolith, where the capstone sat embedded in lead rivets. The mimic raised her misshapen granite arm, casting a massive shadow across the cavern wall. Her voice resonated through the subterranean chamber, a deafening chorus that shook dust from the ceiling stalactites. "You cannot destroy the foundation without perishing in the dark, David." The overlapping voices echoed. "If the seal is broken, the subterranean strata will collapse into the void. You will be entombed 30 feet beneath the earth." David braced his boots against the basalt base, raising the 30-pound hammer over his shoulder. He looked at the disfigured face of the creature, the twisted stone reflection of the woman he had loved. In the suffocating darkness of the pit, a profound clarity washed over his mind. He realized that true love was not a desperate refusal to let go of the physical world. It was not a bitter demand for immortality or an unyielding refusal to accept death. True love was the courage to honor a fragile life, to carry her memory without drowning in darkness. "I don't need a stone monument to remember her," David whispered, his voice steady for the first time. "Clara is already at peace, and you are nothing." With a guttural roar, David swung the heavy sledgehammer with every ounce of remaining strength in his body. The hardened iron head struck the lead-sealed capstone with a deafening crack that sounded like a cannon firing. High-voltage purple arcs of energy erupted from the point of contact, showering the chamber in brilliant sparks. The lead rivets holding the capstone sheared off, and the iron plate shattered into dozens of jagged fragments. The effect on the entity was instant and absolute. The amber veins in the cavern walls flared with blinding intensity before dying out into pitch darkness. The acoustic frequency humming through the air collapsed into a high-pitched whine that dissolved into silence. The mimic's body froze mid-stride, her marble skin fracturing into millions of microscopic cracks. With a low sigh, the creature's physical vessel dissolved, turning from dense rock into a lifeless pile of coarse river sand and clay. Above David's head, the subterranean vault began to tremble as the dark doorway sealed itself forever. Heavy granite slabs dislodged from the ceiling, crashing into the abyss as the mountain foundations settled. Spotting a narrow drainage fissure where underground water flowed, David dropped the ruined hammer. He dragged his exhausted body into the dark stone conduit, crawling on his knees toward the faint scent of cold morning rain. David Vance dragged his bruised body through the mouth of the drainage culvert, tumbling out onto a muddy slope of wet fern and fallen hemlock needles on Blackwood Ridge. He lay on his back in the wet vegetation for a long time, staring up through the forest canopy as the dark storm clouds finally parted, allowing the gray light of dawn to filter down onto the mountain. The torrential rain that had battered the valley for days had ceased, replaced by a gentle drizzle that washed the dried blood, mineral dust, and black clay from his face and coat. For the first time in over a week, the suffocating, unnatural silence that had gripped the woods was gone. The mountain was alive with sound once more. Wind rustling softly through the Douglas firs, rain dripping from needles onto the forest floor, and the distant call of a songbird echoing across the ridge. David sat up, drawing a deep, painful breath of crisp mountain air into his lungs. The heavy, metallic scent of sulfur and crushed granite had vanished completely, replaced by the rich, clean aroma of damp pine bark and wet earth. He pushed himself up onto his shaky legs, using a fallen branch for support as he limped back toward the pioneer clearing. When he reached the site of the ancient homestead, he stopped at the edge of the clearing in silent awe. The yawning black fissure that had torn through the bedrock was gone. The subterranean vault had collapsed completely into the deep earth, causing the ground above to settle into a shallow, natural basin covered in dark soil. The ancient stone well had crumbled into a harmless mound of moss-covered rocks, and the petrified shale that had threatened to infect the forest had softened back into mountain clay. The iron foundation had retreated into the dark, silent depths of the earth, its physical anchor severed forever. David limped 2 miles down the logging road to his truck, finding the vehicle parked along the shoulder where he had left it. The dashboard radio was silent, the unnatural static interference gone. He started the engine and drove slowly down the winding mountain backroads toward the valley below. As he entered the town of Oakhaven, he saw the morning sun rising over the rooftops. The municipal water tower sat quiet against the horizon. The street lamps turned off as the town awoke to a quiet, mundane morning. The regional grid had stabilized, the threat of the subterranean infection completely dissolved. Before returning to his empty farmhouse, David made a final stop at Cedar Crest Cemetery. He parked his truck near the maintenance shed, carrying a small bundle of wild yellow wildflowers he had picked from the forest slope. He walked through the quiet gravel paths, stopping at the eastern corner of the cemetery where his wife's grave was located. The 6-foot pit he had dug 2 nights ago had been completely filled and smoothed over by the groundskeeper. Fresh green grass turf laid neatly over the dark soil. David stepped up to the polished granite headstone bearing her name, Clara Vance, beloved wife. He knelt down on the damp grass, placing the yellow wildflowers gently against the base of the stone marker. Tears welled in his eyes, but they were no longer the bitter tears of drunken denial or desperate rage. They were the quiet tears of a man who was finally ready to grieve, ready to accept the painful, beautiful truth of her memory. "I'm sorry, Clara," David whispered into the quiet morning air, leaning his forehead against the cold granite stone. "I was so afraid of losing you that I almost let the darkness destroy everything you loved. I know you're gone now, but I will carry your warmth with me for the rest of my life." As David stood up and walked back toward his truck, a gentle breeze swept through the cemetery trees, rustling the leaves above her headstone with a sound that felt warm, peaceful, and human. In the archive log of Fear the Shadows, recorded by researcher Ghazal in October 2026 under restricted file SF409, the events at Blackwood Ridge were officially classified as a rare localized seismic collapse. The disappearance of Marcus was recorded as an unsolved missing persons case, his truck remaining parked near the timber trail as a quiet monument to the dark history of the Stone Anchor Fellowship. The ancient well on Blackwood Ridge remains buried beneath tons of settled earth, its location left unmarked on regional forestry maps. Yet, as Ghazal noted in the final entry of the dossier, the story serves as a chilling, timeless warning for those who wander into the quiet places of the world carrying unhealed wounds. Yet, as Ghazal noted in the final entry of the dossier, the story serves as a chilling, timeless warning for those who wander into the quiet places of the world carrying unhealed wounds. Grief is a heavy, painful burden, but attempting to bargain away the reality of loss often invites something far heavier and far colder than death itself into our homes. If you ever find yourself walking through the dark timberlands of Oregon late at night, and you happen upon an old stone well glowing with a pale amber light beneath the moss, do not stop to listen to the whispers echoing from the deep water. And above all, no matter how much your heart aches for what has been lost, never drop a coin into the dark. If this file kept you awake tonight, leave a comment below with your thoughts or share your own encounter. Until next time, pleasant nightmares.